What do you read in the tea leaves of the negotiations now? The second round seem inevitable. Looks like the technocrats might be involved. Your sense of where this overarching conflict's at the moment?
So there's a very long answer to that and a short answer. I'll give you the shorter answer and we can explore more maybe. Um, Both sides need a deal, and whether they say it or not, I'm not sure which one needs a deal more. Possibly the US needs a deal more at this stage, but not having an off ramp would be very painful for both sides. So there's a starting point, which is that's kind of where you'd expect them to go. The negotiations up until now have been, if you get a deal in a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whenever, you look back, you'll say, yeah, this is what it would look like at this stage if you were on track for a deal. I think there was never any possibility of getting a deal on Saturday. Simply not enough time. No diplomatic negotiation is really that enough time, and particularly given this particular situation. But they sat down in a room with each other. They had several hours. It didn't break up in acrimony. It was clearly the first round of a series. So I think we're on the track that we need to be on for a deal to be done. That said, it is a massively difficult challenge. It's a set of difficult interlocking issues which all need to be resolved. The two sides don't trust each other at all with good reason. They've just been in the middle of a shooting war. And then there are various other extraneous factors which make this more difficult, like the position of Israel, which doesn't have the same objectives as Iran, certainly, and actually doesn't have the same objectives as the US and can play a spoiling role. So it's challenging, but the overall driver, I would say, is the two sides need an off ramp.
It certainly looks like if you keep your eyes on the sort of the top level, it seems, oh, of course they'll do a deal. Once you start to even remotely pick the spaghetti pieces apart, it looks just struck with so many potential pitfalls. Jolyon, looking at the sort of deeper to dive into this negotiation, one thing that isn't present is your former workplace, the United Nations. There's no Security Council framework to this process. I know there was some effort last week by the Bahrainis and the Gulf states, or was that 2 weeks ago now, to get a resolution regarding the Strait of Hormuz. But the whole talks that are taking place are being sort of curated by Pakistan. There's no major institution here. Is that good or bad? How do you read this outlook for these talks to deliver something tangible in this time frame, or will it just have to be very token MOU sort of agreement? The absence of institutional framework here, first of all.
So I think the absence of an institutional framework is about how the UN is at the moment. I mean, people talk about, is the UN doing something? Is it not doing something? And it's important to understand the UN as two different things. One is a set of institutions and bodies which do stuff, the funds and programs. The other is basically a rolling international meeting of governments, of states. And that's the bit that's not really working at the moment. So the Security Council is dysfunctional, not because there's something wrong with the UN as an institution, but just because the main players don't really agree with each other on many things at the moment. So I think that's the reason for that. I don't think it's hugely important that Pakistan is hosting talks. We've quite often seen diplomacy of that nature, where one country will help others to get to a deal. Often it's one of the countries in the Gulf region that supports. So I'm not bothered about that. It would be very good if whatever deal is done comes back to the Security Council afterwards and is ratified.
In terms of what it comes back to the point you made earlier, which I think is a pretty big equation to this, given the reporting out of the negotiations last weekend, all the phone calls that JD Vance was making, including to Israel, as you said, there could be the spoiler here. Without the institutional framework of the UN, how do you contain an Israel and all of the actors?
I think you contain an Israel by a hard conversation between the US and Israel saying, this is what we now expect you to do, and this is the consequences if you don't do it. And I think that is what's going to have to happen. Whether the US wants to do that or has the the will to do it, we'll see. I suspect, given the pressure that there will be on the US to do a deal, and the transactional nature of the current administration, I think there will be a point when they probably do start to lean quite hard on Israel to say, domestically, politically, we need to fix this. We're not really interested in the wider stuff that's going on. We just need this deal, and you need to not be spoiling that. And then we see where Netanyahu comes out on it.
Interestingly, in some ways, it seems that the absence of a deal elevates Netanyahu's polling numbers, and the absence of a deal makes his polling numbers go up, whereas the absence of a deal makes Trump's polling numbers go down, and that is sort of a conflict of sorts. Jolyon, I wanted to get your final thoughts on where point we touched on earlier, the sort of the death of the Security Council. Could the rebirth of the Security Council, could the Strait of Hormuz deliver the rebirth of the Security Council, i.e. in the sense that to find some solution here, very, very difficult to see it without, I would hear your Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, talking about 30 or 40 countries coming together, and that's the UN. I mean, you don't need to create another UN. Your thoughts on where the UN will play, or Security Council needs to play, inheriting the solution of the Strait of Hormuz?
I think, coming back to your earlier point, I don't think the Security Council is playing a major role on this. I think it's going to be a series of diplomatic contacts between the US and China, maybe the US and Russia, the US and Europe, other countries trying to help. I mean, we've seen what Starmer has been doing here. I think where the Security Council, I hope, will come in is that when a deal is done between the US and Iran, and that, by the way, could be a series of deals. It's not necessarily going to be one grand deal. I know Trump is talking about that. They can get a deal on some of it within the next couple of weeks to keep economic things moving. Some of it may take longer, but I'd like to see that come back and the Security Council to all gather around and say, yes, okay, we all back this deal, because then everyone's bought into it. That's what I think could be useful at this stage. I think that the problems with the Security Council are much bigger than this. They're not going to be addressed by the current situation.
But ultimately, the Security Council could be presented with the fait accompli that we need you to ratify this in order for this Strait of Hormuz and other to be international law. Like, you hear the rules now about, oh, you can't pay the Iranians a toll because it's illegal, it's sanction busting, it's whatever else. IRGC is a terrorist organization. If the UN was to frame it, it would change the definition of a lot of things.
Yes, I think there are three things so I say it would be good if it came back to the Security Council and was ratified. I think that's for three reasons. One, as you say, the Security Council creates the international standards, international law, so it can say, yeah, okay, we all back this. So what happens under the deal is lawful and legal, which is very helpful for people. I think the second is it says it just, everyone is in the room and says, yes, we agree this. So Russia does, China does, France, the UK, the non-permanent members, the world sort of says, yes, we agree to this deal, and we all get behind it. A bit like at a wedding where you stand up and say, I'm going to stay with this person for the rest of my life, and you're making that commitment in front of everyone. It gives it a bit more weight. So I think there's that part of it. And the third strand of it is there may very well be lots of practical things that have to happen, and that is a point when the UN institutions can help with that, but also it gives a framework for other countries to come in and help with that. For example, mine clearing in the Strait of Hormuz.